A new national approach to eating disorder prevention, early intervention and treatment has been unveiled this afternoon. National Mental Health Commissioner Chief Executive Christine Morgan says there has been a 25 to 50% increase in the diagnosis and treatment of eating disorders since the beginning of the pandemic. She joined me a short time ago and I started by asking what benchmarks should be included in the 10-year strategy.
I think the benchmarks should be a couple of things. Firstly, I always start with this. Is it meeting the needs of real people with real problems around eating disorders? So in other words, not being too theoretical, but really saying what is the reality for people with a lived experience of an eating disorder, what needs to be researched? And that will always be around treatment efficacy, but also around what has caused it. First benchmark. I think the second benchmark is to actually say, is the evidence being translated into changes in the way people are engaging with those with an eating disorder, treating them and supporting them and their families?
Almost 1 million people suffer from bulimia, anorexia and other eating disorders. Has this increased during the pandemic?
Markedly so. And in fact, that figure of 1 million, if I can unbundle it for you, it's based on a point prevalence of 4% of the Australian population. So that was an estimate back, well over about 10 years ago now, when back in Butterfly Foundation. So I would estimate in terms of point prevalence, it's more than 1 million because we have more Australians. But, and this is the really compelling thing, Patricia, during COVID, we have actually seen a 25 to 50% increase in community and hospital presentations of eating disorders, with a particular increase in what we call early onset. So our little people, our 10, 11-year-olds, we're seeing very significant concerning increases, and they're complex presentations. They're ending up often in hospital.
Okay, so why would that be the case? What is the research, the analysis? What are the experts telling us about why we would see younger cohorts of people presenting for this during the pandemic?
So a little bit too early for the formal research on this because, of course, research takes time. But I think some educated assessment of it. Firstly, we know that there is a genetic vulnerability for an eating disorder. It is there in our DNA. And it will get triggered by a number of things, but most commonly when you restrict nutrition. So what causes a young person at increasingly young ages to do that? Body image, absolutely. But also if you've got that vulnerability, things such as increased stress, things such as restrictions, things such as challenges around food, are, if you like, almost the perfect storm created if you've got that vulnerability with how we have managed and had to manage the pandemic in terms of restrictions and lockdowns and those kind of things. If you've got an eating disorder, it will be exacerbated by it.
Okay, and what are the early signs? If you are somebody who cares for, loves young people, what sort of observations can you make to see that this might be emerging?
Look, two things I'd really look for. One, really listen to your young person. And almost always what happens when you have the horror of an eating disorder is that there are significant what we call body image issues. So conversations around body shape, size, feeling bad about that is always a warning sign for any parent or older person, I think. Secondly, any significant changes in eating patterns, particularly restrictive ones, is really important. And thirdly, and parents always know this, I always say it, PK, you can pick it up in mood swings and changes. If somebody's nutritionally depriving themselves, either through restricting or binging and purging, it will start to come out in their mood patterns. So I think it's the conversations they're having and what they're focusing in on, what's happening around their eating and their relaxation or otherwise around eating, and their mood swings.
You say lockdown conditions have created a perfect storm for mental health. Do you expect things will go back to normal once lockdowns end?
Mental health issues will not finish with the vaccine, not by any means. We have said that for quite some time. The mental health impact of COVID per se and the fear that that is a disease, as an illness is generated, the way we have had to manage it in order to protect the public health and the consequences of that, plus then all the economic uncertainties and all the rest of it, as we've talked about before, PK, they trigger mental health reactions, and those reactions will have a considerable time. Like I would say we really need to be keeping a very close eye on things for not months post-vaccines, but actually years, just so we can make sure that we are really trying to bring people back to a place of mental health and wellbeing.
You were previously the CEO of the Butterfly Foundation. You've dedicated a lot of time to this space. What are you most worried about right now?
What I'm most worried about at the moment is trying to ensure that anyone who's at risk of an eating disorder is getting treatment as early as possible. We have this phrase, early in illness and early in episode. So really trying to ensure not just that those who love somebody are alert to it, but that we have our GPs absolutely on board to be able to diagnose it, that we've got referral pathways to skilled practitioners who can actually provide that support, because an eating disorder changes the way your brain works. So being able to get in early and treat it before the brain gets hardwired with the illness is absolutely critical.
I'd love to hear your reflections on the Victorian pathway out of lockdown, the roadmap out of lockdown. Some have criticised it for being too cautious, given the very long lockdowns that Victorians have been subjected to, both last year and, of course, this year. Do you think it's too cautious when you have to measure up the kind of mental health needs of people?
So, as you know from conversations we've had before, PK, I avoid making assessments of public health orders that have been put in place for our own safety. I truly do believe that the experts are doing the very best they can in a situation which is unprecedented. What I will say is that are restrictions having an impact? Are uncertainties having an impact? Absolutely. But one of the interesting challenges we actually are going to have to manage in the mental health space is that as we open up, as those restrictions are lowered, I'm hearing this frequently, people are really scared of coming out of lockdown. So on one hand, we hate the lockdown, we hate the restrictions, but perversely it gives us a sense of security, particularly when it's sitting behind a health order. So for a significant number of people, coming out of lockdown is actually in and of itself causing anxiety. So we're not through any of the complexity of this yet. So we need to ease restrictions. They certainly have an impact on our mental health and wellbeing, but in doing so, we also create further uncertainties and further fears, so we have further things to address.
That's Christine Morgan, the National Mental Health Commission Chief Executive, and this is RN Drive.